So here's the thing about Nobody, and I mean the 2021 film, not the concept of being invisible in society, although weirdly, it kind of is about that too. When the first trailer for Nobody dropped, I remember watching it late at night on my laptop, half paying attention, expecting another mid-budget revenge flick trying to ride the residual wave of John Wick. The marketing made that comparison almost unavoidable. Same writer, same stripped-down aesthetic, same promise. You hurt the wrong guy. But within maybe 40 seconds, something felt different. It wasn't just the violence. It wasn't even the setup. It was Bob Odenkirk. Seeing Bob Odenkirk in that role, suburban dad, slightly slumped posture, that exhausted expression that looks like it's lived through 20 years of compromise. There was something almost mischievous about it. We knew him as Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad and later from Better Call Saul. A talker, a survivor, a guy who weaponizes words, not fists. And the trailer leaned into that expectation. It opens quietly. Domestic routine, alarm clock, commute, garbage day ritual. That subtle disappointment in his son's eyes, the way his wife turns away from him in bed. It doesn't scream, action movie. It whispers, midlife erosion. You almost forget what kind of film you're watching. Then the home invasion happens. 2 amateur thieves break in. He has a chance to shoot one of them, and he doesn't. The trailer doesn't play this as weakness. It plays it as something more complicated. His son looks at him differently. The neighbors look at him differently. He looks at himself differently. And then there's that bus scene tease. I remember the first time the trailer cut to the bus. The lighting is harsh, almost sickly. A group of drunken men get on. There's tension in the air. Not cinematic tension, but the kind you felt in real life when something is about to go wrong and you can't quite name why. Hutch Mansell, that's Odenkirk's character, sits there absorbing it. And then he whispers, almost to himself, "I'm going to F you up." Not screamed, not theatrical, just resigned. The editing in the trailer is sharp there. You don't see everything, just flashes, impact, breath knocked out, teeth, blood, a hand sliding across the floor. It's brutal but not glossy. The sound design in the preview is heavy on bone and breath, not heroic music. That's when I realized this wasn't trying to be slick. It was trying to be physical. And that's a key difference. A lot of action trailers sell invincibility. This one sold damage. Hutch gets hit. Hard. He bleeds. He wheezes. He limps. There's effort in every punch. The choreography, even in those short glimpses, feels closer to desperation than dominance. What really hooked me, though, was the tonal undercurrent. There's a strange humor threading through the footage, dry, almost uncomfortable. Not joke punchline humor, but situational absurdity. A man in khakis and orthopedic shoes methodically dismantling a group of armed criminals. The music choice in the trailer, that warped, ironic use of "What a Wonderful World," adds this unsettling contrast. Domestic life versus carnage. Suburbia versus suppressed rage. And you can feel the influence of producer David Leitch hovering in the DNA. He understands how to stage violence in a way that feels kinetic but readable. Director Ilya Naishuller, who previously made Hardcore Henry, brings that slightly chaotic, immersive edge. Even from the trailer alone, you sense a willingness to get messy. But here's what the preview does really smartly. It doesn't fully explain Hutch. It hints. It teases. It implies there's a past, some kind of government training, some shadow career. But it doesn't dump exposition into your lap. Instead, we get glimpses. A basement full of old weapons. A tattoo that means something in certain circles. A conversation with someone clearly aware of who he used to be. There's a shot in the trailer where a seasoned criminal recognizes him instantly. The shift in that character's face says everything. Fear, respect, calculation. That's good trailer storytelling. Show the reaction, not the resume. And then there's the Russian mob angle. Teased but not fully mapped out. The presence of a powerful antagonist, connected to organized crime, gives the narrative a larger scale. It's not just about a bruised ego or a stolen watch. It escalates into something systemic. Yet the trailer never abandons the core idea. This is about a man who feels invisible. What makes that compelling is that it's relatable without being literal. Most of us aren't retired assassins. But many people understand that slow erosion of identity, the way routine can sand down ambition, the way domestic roles can start to feel like confinement rather than comfort. The trailer positions Hutch not as a hero rediscovering glory, but as someone who almost misses the chaos. That's darker, more psychologically interesting. There's a moment in the preview where he admits, calmly, that he sometimes wishes someone would break into his house again. That line does so much heavy lifting. It reframes the entire premise. This isn't vengeance triggered by trauma. It's awakening triggered by boredom. And that's dangerous. The editing rhythm of the trailer reflects that awakening. It starts slow, almost lethargic. The cuts are longer. The color palette is muted. Beige kitchens, gray offices, pale suburban streets. Then, as Hutch's old instincts resurface, the pace tightens. The lighting becomes harsher. The camera feels closer, more invasive. Even the sound mix grows more aggressive. You hear knuckles cracking, furniture splintering, labored breathing. Not orchestral swells, impact. By the end of the trailer, the scale has expanded dramatically. Explosions, automatic weapons, industrial locations. You realize this isn't just a contained suburban thriller. It's going to spiral. But the marketing never promises spectacle for spectacle's sake. It promises release. And that's an important distinction. A lot of modern action previews focus on escalation, bigger stunts, higher body counts, global stakes. This one focuses on internal combustion. The violence feels like a symptom, not the point. Even the tagline, "Never underestimate a nobody," plays with irony. Because Hutch isn't actually nobody. He's somebody who buried himself. And that inversion is what separates it from being a carbon copy of John Wick. In that film, we know from the beginning that Wick is a legend. The world acknowledges him. Here, the world dismisses Hutch. The rediscovery happens in real time. Watching that trailer for the first time, I remember thinking, this could go either way. It could be a gimmick, casting against type for novelty. Or it could be genuinely subversive. What convinced me it might be the latter was Odenkirk's physicality. You can tell, even in brief shots, that he trained. The movements aren't polished in a martial arts showcase way. They're blunt, efficient, practical. There's a stiffness that actually works for the character, like a man relearning how to move in a body that hasn't been used this way in years. And that bus fight tease, which the trailer smartly doesn't fully reveal, feels intimate rather than grandiose. No shaky cam chaos. You can see what's happening. You can feel the confined space. Every punch has weight because there's nowhere to escape. By the time the trailer ends, you're not just curious about the action sequences. You're curious about Hutch's psychology, about the marriage, about whether this violent resurgence will fix anything or simply destroy what little stability he has left. That's a rare thing for a 2-minute preview to accomplish. It plants questions rather than just selling adrenaline. And sitting there after it finished, I didn't feel hyped in the usual blockbuster sense. I felt intrigued, slightly uneasy, kind of amused, and unexpectedly empathetic toward a man who might be deeply unwell. That blend, discomfort, dark humor, grounded brutality, is what the trailer promises. Whether the full film delivers on that promise is something we'll unpack piece by piece, because there's a lot going on beneath the surface of what initially looks like a straightforward revenge thriller. And that uneasy curiosity the trailer created couldn't have arrived at a stranger moment for the film industry, because nobody didn't just release into a normal theatrical landscape. It walked into one of the most unstable periods modern Hollywood has ever experienced. Originally slated for a late summer 2020 release under Universal Pictures, the film became another casualty of the global shutdown. Theaters closed, release calendars dissolved, studios panicked, marketing campaigns stalled mid-breath. What had been carefully orchestrated windows turned into question marks. And here's why that matters. Mid-budget adult action films, the kind that aren't superhero spectacles and aren't micro-indie dramas, rely heavily on theatrical momentum. They need word of mouth. They need that, you've got to see this bus fight on a big screen energy. Streaming can amplify certain titles, sure, but there's something about visceral action that benefits from shared physical space. When the release date shifted to March 2021, it felt like a gamble. Theaters were reopening cautiously. Capacity limits were still in place in many states. audiences were hesitant. Big studios were experimenting with hybrid models, simultaneous streaming and theatrical drops. Warner Brothers had just made waves by pushing its entire 2021 slate onto HBO Max alongside theatrical runs. Universal could have done something similar here. Instead, they bet on exclusivity, a theatrical-first strategy. That choice signals confidence. Not bombastic confidence, but calculated belief in the product. Nobody wasn't a tentpole franchise with pre-sold IP. It didn't have comic book branding. It didn't have a billion-dollar universe attached to it. What it had was tone, pedigree, and an actor known primarily for television drama. Releasing that in early 2021 meant trusting that audiences were hungry enough to show up for something lean and brutal. There's also a fascinating strategic angle in the timing. March has historically been an interesting slot. Not quite summer, not quite awards season. It's often where studios test out genre films that could overperform if they catch fire. And with the theatrical calendar thinner than usual due to delays, nobody had more breathing room than it might have in a crowded year. The film opened against relatively modest competition. That's important. Without three superhero behemoths dominating every premium screen, a mid-tier action movie could actually find oxygen. And it did. The box office numbers weren't astronomical, but context matters. For a film reportedly budgeted around $16 million, grossing over $50 million worldwide in that environment is not just respectable, it's strategically impressive. Especially considering the audience demographics skewed older than typical blockbuster fare. Adults came out. That's not nothing in a moment when theatrical attendance was heavily youth-driven. But beyond raw numbers, there's industry symbolism here. Nobody represents a continuation of a very specific trend in action cinema, the midlife reckoning action hero. We saw it with Taken and The Equalizer. We saw the revitalization of aging masculinity in films like Logan. There's a cultural appetite for stories about men confronting irrelevance, obsolescence, domestic stagnation. But what sets Nobody apart is its self-awareness. This isn't a power fantasy wrapped in patriotic fervor. It's more ambiguous. Hutch's return to violence isn't framed as purely noble. It's messy. It complicates his family life. It raises questions about addiction to chaos. And that complexity aligns with where audiences were psychologically in 2021. People were restless, trapped in routines, confronting monotony. The idea of suppressed impulses boiling over resonated in a way that might not have landed the same way 5 years earlier. There's also the television-to-film crossover angle. Bob Odenkirk was coming off the critical high of Better Call Saul, widely regarded as one of the strongest character studies on television. That show proved he could carry moral ambiguity for hours at a time. It deepened his dramatic credibility far beyond comedic sketch origins. Hollywood has a long history of underestimating comedic actors' capacity for physical drama. Think about how long it took for someone like Bryan Cranston to shake the sitcom association before Breaking Bad redefined him. Odenkirk was already halfway through that transformation before Nobody pushed him into full-bodied action territory. From an industry perspective, that casting was either a risk or a masterstroke. If audiences rejected the physicality, the film would collapse under disbelief. But if they bought it, the novelty would generate conversation. And conversation, especially in a cautious theatrical market, is currency. There's also the behind-the-scenes factor of writer Derek Kolstad, the architect behind the John Wick universe. His name carried genre credibility. Action fans trust patterns. If someone delivered tight, contained brutality before, there's reason to believe they can do it again, even with a different protagonist. But here's where industry context becomes even more layered. Nobody wasn't trying to build a cinematic universe. It wasn't teasing crossovers. It wasn't dropping post-credit breadcrumbs for a franchise empire. In an era obsessed with interconnectivity, that restraint felt almost rebellious. A standalone, adult-oriented action film with a beginning, middle, and end. That simplicity is deceptively radical in contemporary Hollywood economics. Studios love IP because it reduces risk. Familiar logos mean predictable returns. Nobody had to manufacture familiarity through tone rather than brand recognition. The marketing leaned heavily on the "from the producers of John Wick" line, not as deception, but as shorthand. And that's smart. It anchors expectation without over-promising mythology. Financially, The film's performance validated the viability of modestly budgeted action in uncertain times. It proved you don't need $150 million and a green screen metropolis to create impact. Tight scripts, practical choreography, and strong casting can still draw paying audiences. Culturally, it arrived during a moment when people were renegotiating their relationship with theaters. Would mid-range genre films survive, or would they be swallowed by streaming algorithms? Nobody helped argue for survival. It also benefited from critical response that was generally positive without being hyperbolic. Reviewers appreciated its efficiency. They didn't crown it revolutionary, but they respected its craftsmanship. In a fatigued media landscape, that steady praise matters more than flashy headlines. There's something almost poetic about a film titled Nobody, quietly proving that smaller-scale theatrical releases still have a place. The industry often talks in extremes: blockbuster or art house, franchise or indie. This movie sits in the middle, and the middle is fragile. When you zoom out and look at early 2021, you see studios recalibrating risk tolerance. You see experimentation with distribution windows. You see audiences testing their comfort levels. And into that atmosphere walks a film about a man who's been underestimated, who reclaims space through force. There's thematic symmetry there that feels unintentional but fitting. The film itself was underestimated. It wasn't the loudest title on the slate. It wasn't part of a billion-dollar machine. Yet it carved out its territory. In many ways, its release story mirrors Hutch's arc. Dismissed, overlooked, then suddenly impossible to ignore. And that context, the fragility of theaters, the hunger for tactile cinema, the redefinition of mid-budget viability, shapes how the film lands. It's not just about punches and gunshots, it's about timing. The right film, at the right scale, in the right cultural moment. And once you understand that environment, the casting choices and narrative risks start to feel less like accidents and more like deliberate positioning within a shifting Hollywood landscape. And once you start looking at it through that lens, a mid-budget film strategically positioned in a fragile theatrical ecosystem, the casting becomes even more fascinating, because nothing about this ensemble feels accidental. At the center of it all is Bob Odenkirk as Hutch Mansell, and I want to sit with that choice for a minute, because it's easy to reduce it to unexpected action lead. That's the headline version. The deeper truth is more interesting. Odenkirk built his career on rhythm, comedic timing, verbal dexterity, a certain slippery intelligence. From Mr. Show to Breaking Bad, and especially Better Call Saul, his weapon has always been language. He talks his way through danger. He manipulates systems. He survives through improvisation. Hutch, at the beginning of Nobody, is almost aggressively muted. He's quiet at the dinner table. He's deferential at work. He's overlooked in his own home. Odenkirk plays that suppression with subtlety, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes that flicker with calculation but never fully engage. It's not sad sack energy, it's containment. That's important, because when the violence surfaces, it doesn't feel like a personality transplant. It feels like a release valve opening. What's remarkable is that Odenkirk committed physically in a way most people didn't expect. He trained extensively in stunt work and fight choreography for years before production. You can see it in the bus sequence, not just competence, but muscle memory. He doesn't move like a dancer. He moves like someone who's learned efficiency the hard way, and there's vulnerability in that physicality. He gets winded. He absorbs hits. He winces. The camera doesn't protect him. That willingness to look battered rather than invincible grounds the character. Opposite him is Connie Nielsen as Becca Mansell, Hutch's wife. Now Nielsen has a long resume, from Gladiator to franchise entries like Wonder Woman, and she brings a certain gravitas by default. But what's interesting here is how restrained her role initially appears. Becca isn't written as the stereotypical oblivious spouse. There's distance between them, yes, emotional and physical, but Nielsen plays her as perceptive. There's a sense she knows something about Hutch isn't fully aligned with the suburban narrative. She doesn't pry, but she observes. The marriage dynamic is subtle. It's not explosive. It's quiet disappointment. Separate blankets, polite conversation, years of accumulated compromise. Nielsen's performance keeps that from feeling generic. She communicates history without exposition. Then there's their son, Blake, played by Gage Monroe. He embodies that adolescent tipping point, old enough to question his father's masculinity, young enough to still crave approval. The home invasion moment lands largely because of Blake's reaction. That flicker of doubt in his eyes becomes catalytic for Hutch. It's such a small performance detail, but it drives the narrative. On the antagonistic side, we get Alexei Serebryakov as Yulian Kuznetsov, and I'm glad they didn't cast a cartoon villain. Serebryakov brings volatility rather than mustache-twirling evil. Yulian is impulsive, emotionally erratic, almost childish in his need for respect. He's dangerous not because he's stoic, but because he's unstable. There's a nightclub scene where he performs karaoke, and that moment tells you everything about him. He's theatrical. He craves attention. He wants to be feared and adored simultaneously. That insecurity makes him unpredictable. It also creates an interesting mirror to Hutch. Both men are wrestling with identity and relevance. One expresses it through flamboyant dominance, the other through suppressed lethality. And then there's a casting choice that action fans quietly celebrated. Christopher Lloyd as Hutch's father, David Mansell. Yes, that Christopher Lloyd. The same man who burned plutonium in Back to the Future shows up here in a retirement home, seemingly frail, and then casually reveals he's still very much capable of violence. There's something delicious about that subversion. Lloyd carries decades of cinematic goodwill. Seeing him reload a shotgun with calm precision hits differently because of that history. It's not parody, it's generational continuity. And speaking of continuity, we can't ignore RZA as Harry, Hutch's half-brother. RZA has always had this understated screen presence. He doesn't oversell, he underplays. That works beautifully here. Harry operates like a ghost, quiet, efficient, appearing when necessary. There's a lived-in chemistry between him and Odenkirk that suggests shared history without spelling it out in long speeches. Their dynamic adds texture to the mythology. You realize Hutch didn't come from nowhere. There's a network, a lineage, a family culture of violence that extends beyond suburban facades. Even smaller roles are cast with intention. Hutch's brother-in-law Charlie, played by Billy McClellan, represents performative toughness, the kind that exists comfortably within social boundaries. He owns a business. He carries himself with bluster. But when real danger emerges, the contrast becomes clear. The film uses casting almost as shorthand commentary on masculinity archetypes. Hutch, repressed capability. Yulian, flamboyant insecurity. Charlie, surface-level bravado. David, aging but undiminished lethality. Harry, controlled minimalism. Each male character embodies a different relationship to power. What elevates the ensemble is that no one winks at the audience. There's no sense that anyone thinks they're in a joke. Even the darker humor emerges organically from circumstance rather than mugging. And that's a credit not only to the actors, but to director Ilya Naishuller, who understands tonal balance. He lets performers sit in silence. He allows awkward pauses. He doesn't rush emotional beats just to get to the next explosion. One of the more subtle casting strengths is the choice of Michael Ironside in a supporting role as Hutch's father-in-law. Ironside carries decades of tough guy credibility from genre films. Even his presence in a boardroom scene adds weight. You feel institutional power in the room. The casting across the board reinforces the film's theme: underestimated people in underestimated spaces. Odenkirk was underestimated as an action lead. Lloyd was underestimated as physically formidable. The mid-budget format was underestimated in a streaming-dominated conversation. And the characters themselves are constantly misjudged within the narrative. What I appreciate most about this ensemble is restraint. No one chews scenery unnecessarily. Even Serebryakov's more flamboyant moments feel rooted in character psychology rather than villain theatrics. The relationships also avoid melodrama. Hutch and Becca don't scream at each other in prolonged confrontations. Their distance feels realistic. Years of small compromises rarely erupt in operatic monologues. They calcify. And that grounded approach makes the later shifts in their dynamic more believable. There's also an interesting absence. The film doesn't overload itself with cameos or stunt casting. It trusts its core group. In an era when studios often stack recognizable faces for marketing leverage, nobody keeps its circle tight. That tightness mirrors the film's scale. Intimate violence, limited geography, focused character arcs. When you step back and evaluate the cast collectively, you see a pattern. Performers known for intelligence rather than brute force. That choice shapes the tone. This isn't about muscle-bound spectacle. It's about calculation, history, and consequence. And watching Odenkirk anchor that with a performance that oscillates between exhaustion and terrifying precision becomes the emotional spine of the film. Because at the end of the day, you can choreograph the cleanest fight sequences imaginable. But if the audience doesn't believe the person throwing the punch, if they don't sense internal conflict beneath the surface, it collapses into noise. Here, the cast ensures it never feels like noise. It feels personal. It feels personal. And that's exactly why the story works the way it does. Because on paper, if you reduce it to a logline, it sounds almost aggressively simple. A quiet suburban dad with a hidden past re-enters a world of violence after a home invasion. You've heard that shape before. Hollywood has recycled it in various forms for decades. The retired operative, the dormant assassin, the family man with a buried resume. Structurally, it's familiar territory. What separates nobody isn't the skeleton, it's the texture. The film opens inside routine, not the romanticized version of suburbia, not sun-drenched lawns and sitcom energy, but monotony. Alarm clock, coffee, commute, office repetition, trash can dragged to the curb, missed garbage truck. Small domestic disappointments that accumulate like dust. Hutch Mansell exists in that rhythm like someone who has accepted a downgraded version of himself. He isn't actively miserable. He's dulled. That's more unsettling. His marriage is functional but distant. His son respects him conditionally. His daughter adores him in that uncomplicated way only young children can. His brother-in-law treats him with a kind of casual condescension masked as camaraderie. The home invasion becomes the narrative catalyst, but even that moment is handled without sensationalism. Two desperate individuals break in. The situation escalates. Hutch has an opportunity to respond decisively, and he hesitates. That hesitation changes how everyone sees him, and more importantly, it changes how he sees himself. From there, the story doesn't immediately leap into explosions. It lingers on the psychological aftermath. Hutch's frustration isn't about stolen property. It's about perception. It's about something inside him that he thought was buried but clearly isn't. When he discovers that one small item taken during the invasion holds sentimental value, it pushes him into action. Not in a grand, mission-oriented way, but in a restless, impulsive one. He goes looking for trouble almost subconsciously. And when trouble finds him, in a moment that unfolds in public, in tight quarters, in a setting that feels uncomfortably real, something in him clicks back into place. The violence that follows isn't stylized heroism. It's messy, painful, consequential. You feel every impact. And when it's over, Hutch isn't triumphant. He's activated. That activation ripples outward. The men he confronts aren't random aggressors. They're connected. And that connection pulls Hutch into the orbit of a larger criminal network, one that is structured, prideful, and extremely protective of its hierarchy. What's compelling about the escalation is that it doesn't feel like destiny. It feels like momentum. One decision leads to another. One confrontation triggers retaliation. The story unfolds less like a prophecy and more like a chain reaction. As the stakes rise, pieces of Hutch's past begin to surface. Not through long exposition dumps, but through reactions. The way certain people respond when they recognize him. The way institutions treat him differently once they realize who he used to be. You begin to understand that Hutch wasn't just some low-level operative. He occupied a specific role, one that required precision, emotional detachment, and a willingness to do unpleasant things efficiently. But the film never glamorizes that history. There's an undercurrent of regret. Not overt guilt necessarily, but awareness of cost. Meanwhile, the antagonist emerges not as a faceless crime boss, but as someone deeply invested in reputation and control. The conflict becomes less about money or territory, and more about ego and retaliation. It's personal for both sides, but in very different ways. Hutch's motivation is almost existential. He's confronting his own stagnation. The antagonist's motivation is pride. That asymmetry adds tension. As events spiral, Hutch's family becomes increasingly entangled in the consequences of his reawakening. And this is where the film subtly shifts tone. It stops being solely about one man rediscovering himself and starts asking what that rediscovery costs the people around him. There's a fascinating duality in how the story treats violence. On one hand, it's cathartic. The choreography is satisfying in its clarity. On the other, it's disruptive. It destabilizes domestic life. It forces truths into the open. The pacing is tight. The film doesn't wander into unnecessary subplots. It moves with intention. Every confrontation escalates the conflict logically. There aren't random detours designed purely for spectacle. Even larger set pieces feel like organic extensions of earlier decisions. Geographically, the narrative stays relatively contained. Warehouses, homes, offices, industrial spaces. It doesn't globetrot. That containment reinforces the grounded tone. This isn't a spy thriller spanning continents. It's a localized eruption. Emotionally, though, it expands. Because as Hutch leans further into his former identity, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this who he truly is? Or is it simply who he was trained to be? The film doesn't hand you an easy answer. What I appreciate most in a spoiler-free overview is how carefully the script balances revelation and restraint. It doesn't rush to fully explain Hutch's past. It trusts the audience to piece together context from dialogue fragments and character reactions. There's also an undercurrent of dark humor woven throughout. Not laugh-out-loud punchlines, but situational irony. The absurdity of suburban normalcy colliding with organized crime. The politeness of certain exchanges contrasted with lethal capability. That tonal blend prevents the story from becoming self-serious. And as the narrative builds toward its final stretch, the scale increases without abandoning intimacy. Yes, there are larger confrontations. Yes, there's heavier weaponry. But the emotional stakes remain anchored in family and identity. The climax feels earned because it grows directly out of the choices made in the first act. Nothing arrives from nowhere. The consequences are cumulative. By the time the dust settles, the story hasn't just delivered action sequences. It's explored what happens when someone who has tried to live as nobody realizes that suppression isn't the same as transformation. And importantly, it leaves space for ambiguity. Resolution doesn't mean complete reinvention. It suggests adjustment, a recalibration rather than a fairy tale fix. As a spoiler-free experience, the film works because it understands tension isn't only about external threat. It's about internal fracture. You're not just watching to see if Hutch survives. You're watching to see who he becomes once the dust clears, and whether that version of him can coexist with the life he claims to value. That's a more interesting question than simple revenge, and it sets the stage for a deeper conversation about whether the film truly earns its emotional and thematic ambitions. Because action alone doesn't guarantee substance, and this movie clearly wants to operate on more than one level. And that's really where the conversation gets serious. Because once you strip away the marketing hook and the against-type casting novelty, you're left with the actual question that matters. Does it work? Not as a meme, not as a comparison piece, not as John Wick but suburban. Does it stand on its own legs? The short answer is yes, but not for the reasons some people expect. What immediately struck me when I saw Nobody in a theater was how disciplined it is. It doesn't sprawl. It doesn't overindulge. It understands exactly what kind of movie it wants to be and refuses to inflate itself beyond that. The runtime is lean. The script wastes almost no oxygen. There's an old-school efficiency here that feels refreshing in an era when action films often bloat past 2 hours because they feel obligated to justify ticket prices with scale. This film doesn't apologize for being compact, and that confidence shows in the pacing. The first act takes its time establishing Hutch's monotony, but it never drags. You feel the repetition, but you're not bored. That's a subtle distinction. The film is smart enough to make the routine visually and rhythmically interesting without romanticizing it. Then when the violence erupts, especially in the bus sequence, it doesn't feel like a tonal betrayal. It feels inevitable. Let's talk about that bus scene for a moment, because it deserves attention beyond the hype. The choreography is tight, but what makes it effective isn't complexity. It's clarity. Director Ilya Naishuller and the stunt team stage it in a way that lets you track every movement. There's no frantic cutting designed to mask stunt doubles. The camera stays engaged. You see Hutch take hits. You see him recalibrate mid-fight. You see him almost lose control of the situation. There's exhaustion in it. And that exhaustion is key. In a lot of modern action films, protagonists glide through fights with minimal visible effort. Here, you're acutely aware of breath, of bruising, of time passing inside the confrontation. It's uncomfortable in a good way. But here's the thing. If the movie were only that scene repeated at larger scales, it would get old fast. What keeps it from collapsing into repetition is tone. There's a dry, almost deadpan humor woven throughout. Hutch doesn't deliver quippy one-liners in the Marvel sense. The humor comes from juxtaposition, from the absurdity of suburban politeness intersecting with lethal competence. There's a moment involving paperwork and law enforcement response that lands not because it's flashy, but because it's understated. The world recognizes who Hutch used to be without dramatic exposition. That restraint gives the universe weight. Bob Odenkirk's performance anchors everything. And I don't mean that in a generic he's good way. I mean he calibrates the emotional temperature precisely. When Hutch is passive, he's not pitiful. When he's violent, he's not gleeful. When he's reflective, he's not melodramatic. There's a layered sadness beneath the aggression. It suggests that this man isn't simply reclaiming a suppressed identity. He's wrestling with addiction to chaos. The film never states that explicitly, but it hums underneath the surface. Now, does the movie reinvent the genre? No. Structurally, it follows a familiar escalation pattern. Personal incident, retaliation, larger retaliation, full confrontation. If you've seen enough revenge-driven action, you can anticipate the beats. But familiarity isn't inherently a flaw. Execution is what matters, and the execution here is precise. The antagonist, played by Alexei Serebryakov, adds texture to what could have been a generic mob boss role. He's volatile, emotional, slightly theatrical. That unpredictability creates tension because you can't rely on stoic villain logic. He reacts, sometimes irrationally. That irrationality contrasts with Hutch's calculation. Thematically, the film flirts with commentary on masculinity, particularly the idea of relevance. Hutch feels invisible in his domestic life. He feels dismissed. The violence becomes a twisted form of validation. That's not presented as heroic so much as revealing. The movie doesn't fully interrogate that idea, but it gestures toward it enough to give the action emotional stakes. Where the film really shines is in its practical effects and grounded stunt work. There's a tactile quality to the destruction. Windows shatter convincingly. Bodies react to impact with weight. Fire and debris feel physical rather than digital. In a time when CGI saturation can sometimes dull sensation, this movie's commitment to physicality stands out. The score complements that grounded tone. It's not bombastic. It doesn't scream for attention. It supports the rhythm rather than overpowering it. And the needle drops, especially the ironic song choices, enhance the film's dark humor without feeling forced. Now let's be honest about weaknesses. The female characters, while competently portrayed, especially by Connie Nielsen, don't receive the same depth of exploration as Hutch. The marriage arc is compelling, but it remains somewhat secondary to the action escalation. There's room there that could have been expanded emotionally. Additionally, some viewers might find the final act slightly larger than the grounded setup suggests. The scale increases in a way that edges towards spectacle. It doesn't break believability entirely, but it does stretch the contained tone established earlier. That said, the escalation feels earned within the film's internal logic. And that's crucial. Internal consistency matters more than realism in genre storytelling. What I respect most is that the movie doesn't beg for a sequel. It leaves the door open, sure. Hollywood always does when numbers justify it, but it completes its arc. Hutch's journey reaches a logical resting point. It doesn't feel like a 2-hour trailer for something bigger. In today's franchise-dominated ecosystem, that's refreshing. Emotionally, the film leaves you with a complicated mix of satisfaction and unease. You enjoy the action, you appreciate the craftsmanship, but you're also aware that Hutch's rediscovered identity isn't purely redemptive. He's not becoming better. He's becoming more honest about who he is. And sometimes honesty is destructive. As a viewing experience, it's tightly constructed, confidently performed, and tonally controlled. It doesn't pretend to be profound. It doesn't inflate itself with unnecessary mythology. It delivers exactly what it promises, and does so with intelligence. For a mid-budget action film released in a precarious theatrical climate, that's not just competent, it's impressive. It's impressive, and the more you sit with it, the more small craftsmanship details start revealing themselves. The kind of choices that don't scream for attention, but quietly elevate the experience. One of the most interesting behind-the-scenes facts is just how long Bob Odenkirk trained before cameras rolled. We're not talking about a quick 6-week crash course in choreography. He reportedly spent close to 2 years working with stunt coordinators and martial arts trainers. That kind of preparation isn't common for mid-budget productions. It shows commitment not just to credibility, but to respect for the genre. And you feel that respect in the way the fights are structured. They're not designed to make Hutch look superhuman. They're designed to make him look efficient. There's a difference. Efficiency implies experience. It implies repetition. It implies history without exposition. Another detail that often gets overlooked is the subtle world building through reaction shots. When certain law enforcement figures recognize Hutch's name and immediately change their tone, that's not just a cool moment, it's economical storytelling. The script, written by Derek Kolstad, trusts the audience to infer the weight of Hutch's past without lengthy flashbacks. There's no origin montage, no extended backstory sequence showing him in training camps or secret missions. The absence of those scenes is intentional. Mystery becomes character texture. Then there's the tattoo detail, a small visual cue that carries significance within certain criminal subcultures. The film never over-explains it, but it functions as a kind of silent resume. In the world Hutch once inhabited, symbols matter. Reputation circulates through whispers and ink, rather than LinkedIn profiles. Director Ilya Naishuller also sneaks in stylistic nods to his earlier work on Hardcore Henry. Not through first-person gimmicks, but through kinetic camera placement during close-quarters fights. The lens often sits just far enough away to maintain clarity while still feeling invasive. You're not watching from a safe distance. You're inside the radius of impact. A smaller production detail that adds texture. Many of the action beats rely heavily on practical stunt coordination rather than digital augmentation. Explosions, impacts, environmental destruction, they were staged physically whenever possible. That decision keeps the film grounded visually. You can sense gravity. Objects have weight. Debris behaves realistically. There's also an interesting tonal layer in the music selection. The ironic use of classic tracks, including What a Wonderful World, isn't random. That song in particular has been used in cinema before to contrast brutality with optimism, but here it underlines Hutch's fractured relationship with domestic bliss. The lyrics describe serenity. The visuals contradict it. That contradiction becomes thematic glue. On the casting side, Christopher Lloyd being positioned as a quietly formidable father figure carries intertextual resonance. Audiences bring decades of cinematic memory to his presence. The film leverages that familiarity without parodying it. It's subtle, but powerful. Similarly, RZA brings an understated coolness to Hutch's half-brother. There's a lived-in dynamic between them that implies shared history in high-stakes environments. The script never spoon-feeds that backstory. It simply lets you feel it. One hidden structural detail worth noting. The escalation pattern mirrors Hutch's internal awakening. The early confrontations are small-scale and reactive. Later conflicts become strategic and premeditated. That shift tracks his psychological transition from restless dissatisfaction to deliberate engagement. The film also plays with spatial storytelling in subtle ways. Early domestic scenes are framed tightly, often emphasizing confinement. Doorways, narrow hallways, small rooms. As Hutch re-enters his former world, environments widen. Industrial spaces, warehouses, open layouts. The physical space expands as his suppressed identity reclaims territory. Even the color grading supports that progression. Suburban life appears slightly muted, almost drained of vibrancy. Action sequences introduce harsher contrasts, deeper shadows, sharper highlights. It's not overtly stylized, but it's deliberate. There's also a fascinating production note regarding the film's budget discipline. At approximately $16 million, the team had to prioritize where money went. Instead of sprawling international set pieces, they focused resources on a handful of meticulously choreographed sequences. That constraint arguably improved the film. Limitations can sharpen creativity. Another industry-adjacent detail. The movie's success prompted quiet conversations about expanding its universe, potentially intersecting with other properties written by Kolstad. While nothing official materialized at the time, the idea that this grounded narrative could coexist in a broader mythos intrigued fans. It speaks to how effectively the film establishes a believable underworld without overbuilding it. There are also micro-performance details that reward rewatching. Watch Hutch's body language in early scenes, how he lowers his gaze during confrontations, how he avoids asserting himself physically. Then compare that to later interactions where his posture subtly shifts. He stands taller. His movements become economical. The transformation is gradual, not sudden. And then there's the emotional subtext regarding addiction to adrenaline. The script never labels it explicitly, but Hutch's near smile during certain confrontations hints at something deeper than self-defense. It's as if he's reconnecting with a part of himself he both resents and misses. That ambiguity is intentional. The film doesn't moralize. It presents behavior and lets you interpret motivation. One more small but telling detail. The way secondary characters respond to violence. They don't cheer. They don't treat it as spectacle. There's discomfort, shock, consequence. Even when Hutch wins, the environment around him feels destabilized. That's a subtle tonal distinction from more celebratory action films. From a production standpoint, the shoot reportedly maintained a relatively tight schedule. Efficiency wasn't just thematic, it was operational. That urgency translates into the film's rhythm. There's no sense of indulgent excess. And perhaps one of the most quietly significant facts, the film avoided excessive digital de-aging or cosmetic manipulation. Odenkirk looks his age. Christopher Lloyd looks his age. The wear and tear are visible. That honesty reinforces the story's core theme. Experience, not youth, defines capability. All these details accumulate. Individually, they might seem minor. Collectively, they create a texture that feels intentional rather than accidental. It's easy to watch Nobody once and categorize it as a solid action thriller. But when you peel back the layers, the casting risks, the tonal restraint, the budget discipline, the performance nuance, you start to see a film that understands its lane and maximizes it with precision. And that precision is exactly what makes the conversation about its larger commercial potential so interesting. Because sometimes, the movies that feel modest on the surface are the ones most capable of scaling up without losing their identity. And that's the part that makes this whole thing fascinating. Because when you look at Nobody purely through the lens of scale, it doesn't scream blockbuster. It's not based on a comic book. It doesn't have decades of brand equity. It doesn't rely on global spectacle or fantasy mythology. But blockbusters aren't just defined by budget or capes anymore. They're defined by cultural stickiness. And Nobody has that. First, let's talk economics. Made for roughly $16 million and earning over $50 million worldwide during a fragile theatrical period, it already proved something crucial. The return on investment ratio is strong. Studios don't just chase billion-dollar grosses, they chase profitability margins. A tightly budgeted action film that more than triples its production cost, especially in a compromised market, becomes extremely attractive. That financial math is sequel-friendly, but beyond spreadsheets, there's something else at play here. Scalability without dilution. The world of Nobody is intentionally contained. It hints at a broader underworld, whispered reputations, institutional awareness, coded recognition. But it doesn't map it out exhaustively. That leaves narrative oxygen for expansion without feeling forced. Compare that to overbuilt franchises that front-load world-building before audiences care. Here, the mythology grows out of character rather than exposition. Bob Odenkirk's Hutch Mansell is the anchor, and that's key. Blockbuster potential often hinges on iconic protagonists. Hutch isn't flashy. He's not mythologized in the same way as a superhero. But he's relatable in a way that resonates with adult audiences who rarely see themselves reflected in action leads anymore. He's middle-aged. He's tired. He feels overlooked. That emotional accessibility gives the character longevity. Audiences don't just want spectacle. They want identification. And Hutch's crisis of relevance taps into something culturally pervasive, the fear of becoming invisible. Then there's the tonal lane. The action genre right now exists in a few dominant categories: superhero spectacle, hyper-stylized assassin ballets, and nostalgia-driven legacy sequels. Nobody occupies a slightly different space. It's grounded but not grim, violent but not nihilistic, funny but not comedic. That balance broadens its audience. It appeals to action purists who appreciate practical choreography. It attracts fans of character-driven drama because of Odenkirk's pedigree from Better Call Saul. It satisfies viewers craving catharsis without 2.5-hour commitments. That cross-demographic appeal is quietly powerful. Now consider franchise elasticity. The film ends in a way that feels complete, yet open. Hutch's identity is no longer suppressed. His family dynamic has shifted. His former world knows he's active again. That creates organic narrative pathways for future installments without retconning the original arc. And because the budget isn't astronomical, expansion doesn't require immediate escalation into globe-trotting insanity. The sequel potential can grow incrementally. New adversaries, deeper exploration of Hutch's past, maybe even examining consequences more thoroughly. Another factor in blockbuster viability is repeat viewing. Action films that rely solely on shock value often lose potency on rewatch. Nobody, however, benefits from detail. The choreography clarity, the micro-expressions in performances, the tonal layering, these reward a second viewing. That rewatch value drives long-term streaming performance and word-of-mouth momentum. Streaming, by the way, is another multiplier. While the film proved itself theatrically, its compact runtime and sharp pacing make it highly streamable. In an algorithm-driven environment, efficiency matters. People are more likely to click on a 90-minute, tightly constructed thriller than a sprawling epic requiring full attention commitment. That accessibility increases cultural footprint over time. There's also the casting factor. Bob Odenkirk's transformation into a credible action lead isn't a one-off novelty anymore. It's established. Audiences now accept him in that physical register. That acceptance reduces risk for follow-ups. Add to that supporting players like Christopher Lloyd and RZA, who bring generational and cultural reach. You're not just appealing to one demographic slice, you're bridging age groups. And let's be honest about something. Audiences are increasingly fatigued by over-polished, effects-heavy action. There's a growing appetite for tactile filmmaking, practical stunts, real bruises, visible strain. Nobody leans into that appetite. It reminds viewers that action can be intimate. There's also the meme factor, not in a cheap viral gimmick way, but in the way certain scenes become cultural shorthand. The bus fight, for example, transcended the movie itself. It circulated online. It sparked reaction videos. It entered genre conversation. Moments like that are seeds. Blockbusters aren't just big movies. They're movies people talk about. Another interesting angle is the thematic elasticity. Hutch's struggle with relevance can evolve as the character ages. Future installments could explore the cost of re-engaging with violence. They could interrogate whether identity reclaimed is identity sustained. That's rich territory. From an industry standpoint, studios love properties that can grow without requiring massive reinvention. Nobody doesn't need to become something else to scale. It just needs to deepen. And perhaps most importantly, it avoids cynicism. Despite its violence, the film doesn't feel nihilistic. There's a strange warmth beneath the chaos, a suggestion that confronting who you are, even the darker parts, can lead to recalibration rather than annihilation. That tonal optimism broadens mainstream appeal. Blockbuster status doesn't always mean immediate $800 million grosses. Sometimes it means franchise viability, cultural presence, and sustained profitability. Nobody checks those boxes. It proved mid-budget adult action can survive theatrical uncertainty. It established a protagonist with emotional relatability. It demonstrated scalable world building. It delivered memorable, rewatchable set pieces. It balanced tone without collapsing into parody or self-seriousness. That combination is rare. And in a landscape where studios constantly chase the next pre-branded universe, sometimes the smartest move is nurturing something lean, character-driven, and expandable. Because if there's one thing Hollywood history shows us, it's that underestimated properties, the ones that don't arrive with billion-dollar expectations, often have the clearest runway to grow. And that makes the journey of a film called Nobody feel almost perfectly named. If you've stayed with me this long, then you already understand something important. Nobody was never just about a bus fight, or a body count, or the novelty of seeing Bob Odenkirk throw a punch. It was about invisibility, and more specifically, about what invisibility does to a person over time. When we first meet Hutch Mansell in Nobody, he isn't broken, he isn't tragic, he isn't even obviously miserable. He's functioning. That's what makes it uncomfortable. He's doing everything he's supposed to do, providing, commuting, showing up. And yet he's fading. That's the real horror the film taps into. Not organized crime, not gunfire, not retaliation. It's erosion. The slow sanding down of identity until you can't quite remember what you were before routine reshaped you. And here's where the movie gets smarter than it initially appears. Hutch doesn't discover he's capable of violence. He already knows that. The audience slowly learns it, but he doesn't. What he discovers is that suppressing who he was didn't erase it. It just buried it under resentment. That resentment doesn't explode because of the home invasion. The invasion is just a spark. The fuel has been accumulating for years. That's why the action feels earned. The violence isn't random spectacle. It's an expression of something long contained. And while the film gives you the adrenaline rush, it also quietly asks whether that rush is healthy. There's a moment near the end, subtle, not shouted, where you can see it on Hutch's face. He isn't just fighting to survive. He's fighting because this is the one arena where he feels fully present. That's complicated. And the movie never resolves that complication neatly. It doesn't turn him into a shining hero. It doesn't condemn him outright. It lets you sit in the ambiguity. His marriage improves, yes, but not because he suddenly became gentle. It improves because he stopped pretending. There's something honest about that. When you look at the broader action landscape, so much of it is built around escalation without introspection. Bigger villains, bigger explosions, bigger universes. Nobody scales outward, sure, but it always circles back inward. That's why it sticks. It understands that the most dangerous thing about a man like Hutch isn't his training. It's his dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction is relatable. We may not share his skill set, but many people understand what it feels like to be underestimated, to feel sidelined, to question whether the version of yourself you present daily is the full truth. The movie doesn't offer a self-help solution. It doesn't suggest that the answer is violence, but it does confront the reality that pretending to be smaller than you are can be corrosive. That theme gives the film unexpected weight. It also explains why audiences responded so strongly. In a time when so many people were stuck in repetitive cycles, uncertain about identity and relevance, this story of a man reclaiming agency, however messy, resonated. And that resonance is what gives it longevity. Years from now, when people revisit the early 2020s action era, they'll see a landscape dominated by spectacle. But nestled within it will be this lean, tightly constructed film that bet on character over bombast. That's not an accident. It's craft. From the restrained direction of Ilya Naishuller, to the economical writing of Derek Kolstad, to the physical commitment of Odenkirk, everything aligns around a singular intention. Make it feel real enough to matter. And it does. Not because it reinvents the genre, not because it overwhelms you with scale, but because it remembers that action, at its best, is about stakes. Emotional, personal, internal. By the time the credits roll, you don't feel like you've watched a man become someone else. You feel like you've watched him stop pretending to be nobody. And that's a far more unsettling transformation. If you value action films that respect intelligence, that trust performance, that balance brutality with introspection, this one deserves a place on your list. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about saving the world. They're about refusing to disappear inside it. There's something oddly specific about the feeling of walking into a theater for nobody. Not opening night Marvel energy. Not awards season prestige quiet. More like curiosity. When I went to see Nobody, the lobby wasn't buzzing. It wasn't dead either. It felt transitional, like people were cautiously rediscovering theaters again. A few couples. A couple of guys clearly there for the action. Some older viewers who probably knew Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul. And that already told me something. This wasn't pulling in teenagers on hype alone. It was attracting adults. People who wanted something lean and sharp. I remember buying popcorn and thinking, okay, is this going to be a gimmick? Or is this going to surprise me? Because casting Odenkirk as a brutal action lead still felt slightly surreal. You know him as clever, fast-talking, slightly slippery. Not the guy who breaks ribs in a city bus aisle. Walking into the auditorium, the vibe felt grounded. No loud pre-show chatter about cinematic universes. No merch conversations. Just that low hum of anticipation. And I think that's the right energy for this movie. It doesn't demand spectacle before it earns it. When the lights dimmed and the opening scenes started rolling, the alarm clock, the routine, the repetition, there was this quiet tension in the room. You could feel people waiting, not impatiently, just curious when the switch would flip. That's a powerful first impression, because the film doesn't open with an explosion, it opens with monotony. And sitting there in the dark, watching Hutch move through his life like a man slightly out of sync with himself, you start leaning forward. You're not watching for chaos yet. You're watching for a crack. And when that crack finally shows up, subtle at first, the theater shifts. There's that almost physical tightening in the room. People stop rustling bags. The air changes. By the time the bus scene hits, it's not rowdy applause. It's stunned silence followed by those sharp audience reactions you can't fake. That collective, "Oh," when a hit lands harder than expected. That was my first impression walking in and sitting down. This isn't flashy. This isn't overhyped. This is controlled. And controlled can be dangerous. Because when a movie holds back early, when it doesn't beg for your adrenaline immediately, the payoff lands heavier. Walking out afterward felt different too. Not euphoric, not blown away in a spectacle sense. More like satisfied, slightly shaken, impressed that something so compact delivered that much impact. It felt like discovering a movie that knew exactly what it was and didn't need to shout about it. And honestly, that quiet confidence was the most powerful first impression of all. Alright, because at its core, nobody isn't just about suppressed rage or reclaiming identity. It's about control. Who has it, who loses it, and what happens when someone who's mastered it decides to let it slip. Let's really examine Hutch's home life from a structural standpoint. When we first see him, he's not a disaster. He's not divorced. He's not unemployed. He's not spiraling. On paper, his life works. But watch the blocking in those early scenes. He's physically separated from his wife in bed. He's slightly out of rhythm at the breakfast table. He's framed alone even when other people are in the room. That's intentional filmmaking. Director Ilya Naishuller uses space to show emotional distance before the script ever spells it out. Hutch isn't failing at life. He's disconnected from it. And that's more unsettling, because it means the problem isn't external. It's internal restraint. Hutch is a man who chose restraint. Here's a layer we haven't fully examined. Hutch wasn't forced into normalcy. He chose it. And that changes everything. He walked away from something lethal. He built a small business. He tried to live quietly. That's not weakness. That's discipline. Which makes the home invasion scene fascinating. Not because he fails to fight back, but because he evaluates the situation like a professional. He calculates risk. He chooses containment over escalation. The audience initially interprets that as cowardice, but it isn't. It's control. And what frustrates him isn't the burglars, it's being judged by people who don't understand that calculation. That's psychologically rich, because it taps into something deeply human, the frustration of being misread. The bus scene, not catharsis, calibration. Most viewers describe the bus sequence as cathartic. I don't. I think it's calibration. When Hutch boards that bus, he isn't blindly angry. He's testing himself. He's measuring how much of the old version still exists. Notice how he takes hits on purpose. He absorbs punishment. That's not sloppiness. That's assessment. He's checking whether the instincts still fire. And when they do, there's that flicker of something dangerous. Not joy, recognition. That's a subtle difference. The Russian mob as a mirror. Let's talk about Yulian. Played with theatrical volatility by Alexei Serebryakov, Yulian isn't just a villain. He's ego without restraint. He sings in clubs. He flaunts power. He reacts emotionally. In many ways, he's the version of Hutch that never chose to disappear. Where Hutch suppressed himself, Julian indulged himself. That dynamic turns their conflict into more than revenge. It becomes ideological. Control versus indulgence. Discipline versus impulse. One man hides his power, the other broadcasts it. And when they collide, it feels inevitable, not random. Masculinity without posturing. Here's something bold. This film critiques masculinity without mocking it. Hutch doesn't want dominance for applause, he wants significance. That's different. A lot of modern action films either glorify hypermasculinity or deconstruct it with irony. Nobody doesn't do either. It portrays a man who once defined himself by capability, then tried to redefine himself by restraint, and discovered that suppressing capability entirely creates imbalance. The movie isn't saying, violence is the answer. It's saying pretending you're harmless when you're not creates psychological friction. That nuance is rare in mainstream action. The sound design of brutality. We haven't talked about the sound work yet, and we should. The punches in this film don't sound glossy. They're thick, wet, heavy. There's a realism to the audio mix that avoids stylization. Unlike the polished gun-fu rhythm of films written by Derek Kolstad and other franchises, this one feels grounded. Each impact has consequence. Each reload feels manual. It makes the violence intimate, uncomfortable, personal. And that's deliberate, because spectacle creates distance, texture creates immersion. The warehouse finale, strategic chaos. By the time we reach the warehouse showdown, the film could have gone full operatic. It doesn't. Yes, it escalates. Yes, it delivers explosive payoffs. But structurally, it stays tactical. Hutch sets traps. He engineers the battlefield. He doesn't charge blindly. That's important, because it reinforces the theme of control. Even in chaos, he's orchestrating. He isn't reckless, he's methodical, which makes the final confrontation feel earned rather than indulgent. The marriage revisited. Let's revisit the marriage, but differently. It would have been easy to frame Hutch's rediscovered violence as what fixes his relationship. But that's not actually what happens. What changes is transparency. His wife finally sees the part of him he concealed, and instead of recoiling, she recalibrates. That's subtle. The film doesn't dramatize their reconciliation with speeches. It shows proximity returning, physical closeness, shared understanding. It suggests that intimacy requires honesty, even if that honesty is uncomfortable. That's surprisingly mature storytelling for an action vehicle. Aging and capability. Casting Bob Odenkirk was genius for another reason we haven't fully explored. He doesn't look invincible. He looks human. When he gets hit, you believe it hurts. When he bleeds, you believe he feels it. That shifts the dynamic entirely. We're not watching youthful dominance, we're watching accumulated experience. And that resonates differently, because it acknowledges aging without diminishing capability. It says skill doesn't vanish with time. It evolves. That's empowering in a quieter way. Why this film works beyond trend cycles. Action cinema moves in waves. Right now we're in an era of expanded universes and crossovers, but compact, self-contained stories often age better. Nobody doesn't rely on mythology, it relies on psychology, and psychology doesn't expire. That's why this film will likely hold up longer than flashier releases from the same period, because it's anchored in something human. Discontent, identity, control, recognition. The emotional aftertaste. What lingers after the credits isn't just the choreography, it's the tension between who Hutch was, who he tried to be, and who he ultimately accepts himself as. The final moments don't scream sequel bait, they suggest equilibrium. Not perfection, not redemption, equilibrium. And that's satisfying in a different way, because life rarely gives us clean arcs, it gives us adjustments. If we step back and look at this movie from every angle, performance, structure, sound design, character psychology, what becomes clear is that it's far more deliberate than its marketing suggested. It wasn't sold as a meditation on identity, it was sold as a surprise action vehicle. But what it delivered was something more layered. And that's why we're still talking about it, because beneath the punches and gunfire, beneath the bruises and broken bones, it tells a story about a man negotiating with himself. And that's a conflict that never goes out of style. If you've watched this film once, I'd argue it deserves a second viewing. Not for the spectacle, but for the subtleties. Watch the pauses, watch the framing, watch the moments where nothing explodes. That's where the real story lives. And that's what elevates Nobody from just another action movie to something that actually lingers.